All right, today we are going to continue our look at Babylon. Last week we were introduced to this weird, strange, somewhat scary place called Mystery Babylon. I mean, you can't get scarier name than that, just about. But we saw its defeat, so that's pretty good. So if it was defeated last week, as depicted by the Scarlet Woman on a beast, how do we still have it around this week? Well, let's take a look at where we've been and where we're going first of all, last week in Revelation, or in our last session in Revelation 17, we learned a few things, and here they are. Revelation 17, we learned that Babylon is a world power. We learned that it is empowered by Satan. We learned that it is leading the world into idolatry. Adultery equals idolatry in scripture. Remember that. I mean, not actual physical adultery between people, but any time God uses the term adultery to refer to spiritual things, it's always as a synonym for idolatry. And fourthly, Babylon was destroyed by the beast. So again, if Babylon has already been destroyed by the beast, and we saw it already in chapter 17, then what's going on in chapter 18 that it's still around? Well, here's the best way that I know to explain it. In chapter 17, it concentrated on Babylon as a religious system, mixing all the religions together, thus producing spiritual adultery because of her idolatry. So the destruction of that aspect of her is described here. But Babylon is as much a spirit and an attitude as a place. The attitude has been attacked and destroyed, but the place and the political power behind the place are what's now addressed in chapter 18. So, in chapter 18, it seems to be more firmly established as a specific place or a specific city, or potentially, even the way the world runs today, a specific company or conglomeration of companies. Um, Kind of like the movie industry is called Hollywood, right? Most of the people who are involved in the movie industry don't live in Hollywood. There's a bunch who do, obviously. But when we say it's a Hollywood production, you can have a whole bunch of people in it who have never been in the city of Hollywood, right? So Hollywood, the place, has come to symbolize the entertainment industry. Babylon seems to be the same thing. There seems to be a central focus on a city, perhaps what's now modern day Baghdad, which is where ancient Babylon was located. Perhaps, some other city, we don't know. We looked at some of the candidates last week, last conversation anyway. But what we're talking about here is both an attitude and a place and a political power. And so today, what we're going to take a look at is the continuing fall of Babylon in three parts. We're going to look at Babylon's sin. We're going to look at Babylon's sin, Babylon's fall, and Babylon's judgment. So, starting with Babylon's sin, chapter 18, beginning with verses 1 through 3. Let's take a look at them. Revelation 18, 1 through 3. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. With a mighty voice, he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons and a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries." So, what's happening here? First of all, an angel with great authority, it says so in verse 1, he had great authority, prophesies the fall of Babylon as a political and economic power. Now, how do we know that he's prophesying it as a economic and political power? Because verse 3 tells us that the kings of the earth, that's politics, committed adultery with her. The merchants of the earth, that's economics, grew rich from her excessive luxuries. So that's what you've got here. We actually, it's interesting because back in the era when this was written, political and military power was absolute. They brought with it they brought with them luxuries, and they brought with them economic clout. But the idea of separating an economic power from a political or military power was almost unheard of. Today, however, we have companies that are as economically large and powerful as all but a handful of nations on the earth, right? Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, These companies are bigger and more powerful than all but three, four, five nations on the earth, right? Their power is huge, and their power is growing because it's not limited by geographical boundaries. So their potential for growth is literally unlimited. So in the future, this Babylon, is it going to be more of an economic power than a political or geographical power? Probably, but I think they're all going to be tied together. You're going to have a physical locality. You're going to have a political heft to it. You're going to have a spiritual influence to it, and you're going to have economic power to it. It's going to encapsulate all of those things. So the angel comes out and says that Babylon is going to fall, both as a political power and as an economic power. Actually, an interesting side note to this, I was talking with a missionary not long ago, and he was saying that because we were talking about this idea of economic power now having as much, or in some places greater clout than political power, and he was smiling. He said, do you realize there are a lot of places in the world where missionaries go where they are told by the missionary sending society to make sure that they have an American Express card, because in certain places in the world, if you get into trouble, you will get more help by calling American Express than by calling the American Embassy. Not weird? That they economic powers have a greater ability in some situations to put together influence and to actually be able to help you there. That's where it is. So that's where. But it's a combination of all these things that happens here. So Babylon's sin is going to fall. Is going to create her to fall. So what was Babylon's sin? Let's take a look at that. That's the second part. Babylon's sin was that of spiritual adultery. So remember, spiritual adultery, it means idolatry, means worshiping gods other than the God. Like when a husband or wife commits adultery on their spouse by having sexual relationships with someone else. Okay. Um, so what was the hook that got people to commit the sin? We saw it in verse 3. The merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. She convinced others into this sin by appealing to their greed. I want to take a moment on this because there's a weird division within the Christian church today, and it's probably been around for a long time, where you've got certain churches, evangelical churches, conservative churches particularly, and the sins that we tend to concentrate on are sexual sins, and almost exclusively in some situations. That's a really, really big deal for us. But then you've got the churches that are on the more liberal side of things, and they almost seem to ignore sexual sins, and they're concerned with sins of injustice and poverty. The Christian response, if you're going to look at the balance of the Bible, is that they both matter. We can't be a church that stands back in horror at sexual sin, but forgets to condemn the companies that are taking widows' property away from them in a deceptive manner. And we can't be on the other side where we're social justice warriors, but we forget about individual integrity and sexual morality. The Bible addresses both, but somehow we have split these two in our heads, and we've thought that, anybody, like I've heard things where if you go to a church where the term social justice is used, run away fast. It's going to be falling into all kinds of spiritual problems. And have I been in churches where social justice is the only thing they talk about and they seem to ignore individual sins? Yes, and those are problems. But equally on the other side, you've got churches that only address individual sins and don't see the corporate greed that goes on. And by corporate, I don't necessarily just mean corporation. I mean communal. I mean, we've got a society that puts economic comfort quite often ahead of our integrity. And the Bible says both of those things matter. It's not one or the other, it's both and. So the sin of Babylon, while it is called adultery, which is a sexual term, the primary hook that brought people in was greed. Look at the luxuries, look at the cool stuff we can get for you. And that, I think, is where we really are as a society in a lot of ways, especially here in North America, especially in North America, Europe, in the developed part of the world where we have a lot of things. The idea of losing some of our luxuries. And again, we don't consider them luxury. I don't consider my iPhone a luxury. I use it every day, all the time for basic things like communication. But we still have to realize 3/4 of the world is without an iPhone or any kind of electronic ability to communicate. I mean, it's not as common as we think. It is not as much a necessity as we think. So appealing to our greed for things that we've grown used to will be a real hook that a Babylon will have in the end times. So God takes both things seriously. He takes the individual integrity side seriously, and he takes the community justice side seriously. And as Christians, we need to have that balance. And Babylon will appeal to the negative side of both of those things, and that both of those things need to be overcome. God takes both seriously. So let's take a look at the result of this in verses 4-6. Then I heard another voice from heaven say, "Come out of her, my people," that is, come away from Babylon and her attitudes, "so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Give back to her as she has given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Pour her a double portion from her own cup." This is a really interesting phrasing here. Let me walk you through it. First of all, it says that Babylon will receive a double portion of the grief she brought to others. Now, the word double is mentioned twice, so it really matters. So let's take a look at it again. Verse 6, well, before it says, get away from her. Her sins are piled up to heaven, and God remembers them. So that's okay. We got some serious stuff going on here. But take a look at how it's going to come back to her. It's going to come back to her as she has given it. So it's going to be just. It's not going to be a mismatch, eye for an eye here. Pay her back double. Wait a minute. That's two eyes for one eye. That doesn't make sense, except that it then follows it by saying, pour her a double portion from her own cup. So it is directly from her and from what she's caused to others, and then double portion. For us today, double portion sounds like 2 times. That's not what it meant to the original hearers. A double portion, this is how inheritance worked in their day, the double portion. And this is mentioned many, many times in scripture. Imagine that a man has 5 sons, and he writes out his will so that his sons know what they will inherit. The way they did it in their culture was this: if you had 5 sons, you divided all of your assets into 6 groups. 5 sons, 6 pieces. The oldest son got 2 pieces. Each of the other sons got 1 piece. So 5 sons, 6 pieces. The oldest son gets 2 pieces, and each of the other ones each get 1. So the oldest son doesn't get a double of the inheritance. The oldest son gets double what the other sons get. That designates him as the head of the family. So that's what double portion means. Double portion doesn't mean what you gave in, you get back 2 of. Double portion means you're going to receive based on your inheritance. So what he's saying is your sin has put this curse in the line of your inheritance. You deserve this. You're not just going to get a single inheritance. You, Babylon, are the firstborn of sinners. And so you're going to receive the penalty for leading others into that sin. Just like the oldest son would be the head of the family and would lead the family, you, Babylon, have taken the role of the elder brother by leading everybody else into sin. Since you've taken the role of the elder brother in sin, you're going to receive the elder brother's double portion of penalty. See what we're talking about here? So Babylon is going to receive a greater penalty because she took the lead in sin and in leading others into a place of sin. So it's a little interesting, way of phrasing things that we're not used to. But every single first century Jew who read double portion, they knew exactly what that meant. This is the double portion way that people would give their inheritance to their sons. Okay, so let's continue on that to verses 7 and 8. The angel continuing to speak says this: "Give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself." You see again how it's matched to the degree she gave herself, or another translation says took it unto herself. This is not what she earned. This is what she took. This is what she stole. Okay. And basically for everything she stole, she's going to receive an equal amount in torment and grief. Verse 7 continuing, in her heart she boasts, I sit enthroned as queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn. What is it? What is it that comes before a fall? Pride. Talk about pride, right? Verse 8. Therefore, in one day her plagues will overtake her. When this happens, the collapse will be fast. Death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. So Babylon will receive torture and grief to match the glory and luxury she took for herself. What you stole in glory and luxury, you will receive an equal amount in torture and in grief. Why? Because you didn't earn it correctly. There's nothing wrong with having good things. There's nothing wrong with working hard and making more money than your neighbor. If you've earned it honestly, that's fine. There's nothing unbiblical or wrong about that whatsoever. But if you stole it, if you created an unfair environment so that you benefit more than somebody else does, if you created a system that intentionally hurts others so that you can be benefited by it, God's paying attention to that. The prayers of people who have been treated unjustly are going into that incense burner that we talked about earlier, and God will pay back in the same cup that you took it from. So there's justice in here in many ways. It's a just thing that we see laid out here. So we move from Babylon's sin now to Babylon's fall. Let's take a look at it in verses 9 through 10. When the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared her luxury see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her. Terrified at her torment, they will stand afar off and cry, woe, woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour your doom has come. So we've seen Babylon sin, we've seen why Babylon falls, and now when it falls, we see the reaction of those that she tempted into her sinfulness. And the kings of the earth will panic over the destruction of Babylon. It says weep and mourn, but it also says at the beginning of verse 10 that they are terrified at her torment. That's panic. So this is like, the great panic, the great economic panics that we've seen happen in the world, and hopefully is not going to be coming again within our lifetime, although we're in a situation now where who knows what will happen. But I'm not feeling panic in the air. I'm feeling concern. I'm feeling worry. I'm not feeling panic yet, thankfully. But when Babylon's destruction comes, those who watch it will be in panic out of the severity of her fall, the suddenness of her fall, and the realization that she's falling because of her sin, and we participated in that sin, so we may be next. So they are not mourning over how much they loved Babylon. They are mourning and they are in panic because of what they received and the losses, and that they're not going to have cool stuff anymore. We know that because take a look at the next verses. Here's what they're panicking over. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because they loved her? No, because no one buys their cargoes anymore. They've lost their customer base. This is not about love. This is just raw, brutal capitalism and unfair capitalism with the system rigged against the poor people. Let me read it again, verse 11. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Their customer base is gone. Verse 12, cargoes, and take a look at think through each of these items in their cargo and what do they have in common? Cargoes of gold, silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, and articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense, myrrh and frankincense, of wine and olive oil, of fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, and human beings sold as slaves. Now, what does all that cargo have in common? Well, we'll get to it in a second. First of all, the reason they are weeping is because no one's going to buy their cargo anymore. They have stuff to sell, and there's nobody to buy them anymore. So their luxuries are going to sit rotting on the dock. And take a look at what's common in all of that cargo. Did you notice it? Even if you're not sure about what some of those things are necessarily, take a look at some of the qualifying words. Fine, costly, fine again, right? These are gold, silver, precious stones. What is it? These are all luxuries. All of her cargo is luxury. There's not basic stuff in there. There's no wheat in there. There's no barley in there. There's no rice in there. There's no beans in there. There's no clothing in there. It's fine ivory. It's fine linen, silk, scarlet cloth, right? These are very expensive things. It's not cotton, right? It's not basic stuff. It's very, very expensive stuff. Nobody's buying cargo anymore, and all of the cargo is luxury. There are a lot of people who say that thieves only steal because they're poor, but the evidence doesn't back that up because rich people steal too. And have you noticed, if you go to stores, they're not locking up the potatoes, they're locking up the iPhones. Theft is not about poverty. Yes, there are times and there are places of extreme poverty where people are so hungry that they're stealing the basics of life. Yes, that occurs. Absolutely. And those situations deserve a completely separate response from what I'm talking about now. But in general, most of the crime that is committed on the earth today is not committed by poor people who need to eat. Most of the crime that's committed on the earth today is committed by already wealthy people who want more. Cyber crime, white collar crime, right? Those kinds of things. Those are not poor people crimes. And the amount of money, the amount of goods that is stolen by the wealthy who want more wealth far outweighs the apples and potatoes that are stolen by poor people who need to eat. So theft is not about uh, being poor and needing to eat. The theft that they're talking about here is rich people trying to get even richer. All of her cargo is luxury, and the loss of that is what they're mourning. It then continues on, and we'll read a big chunk of it now, verses 14 through 20. They will say, the fruit you longed for is gone from you. All your luxury and splendor have vanished, never to be recovered. Again, luxury and splendor is what they're worried about. Verse 15. The merchants who sold these things and gained their wealth from her will stand far off, terrified at her torment. Remember what I said earlier? Panic, right? Terrified at her torment, they will weep and mourn and cry out, woe, woe to you, great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. In 1 hour, such great wealth has been brought to ruin. Every sea captain and all who travel by ship, the sailors and all who earn their living from the sea, and everybody who delivers for FedEx and UPS, I added that, but that's what we're talking about, right? Delivery systems will stand far off. When they see the smoke of her burning, they will exclaim, was there ever a city like this great city? They will throw dust on their heads and with weeping and mourning cry out, woe, woe to you, great city, where all who had ships of the sea became rich through her wealth. In 1 hour she has been brought to ruin. Rejoice over her, you heavens. Rejoice, you people of God. Rejoice, apostles and prophets, for God has judged her with the judgment she imposed on you. Again, that last phrase is about the fairness of this. So let's take a look and break down these handful of verses one at a time. First of all, it says in verses 14 and 15, those who got rich with her will panic. Terror will come upon them. Verse 16 tells us that even her clothing is luxurious. We're not talking about basic clothing. We're not talking about cotton. We're talking about fine linens and scarlet and so on. And then her destruction will be sudden and complete. In 1 hour, they're going to stand back amazed at how fast the thing fell. Because here's the reality of it. As strong as luxury companies look, they're actually built on a very uneasy foundation, and they collapse really, really quickly. I think we're going to see some of that over the next few months and years. I think you're going to be shocked at some of the companies that seemed strong that will collapse, and some of the other companies that are just basic companies that their engine just keeps running because they're providing the basic things that people actually need. It then says, those who mourn her don't miss her, but they will miss her wealth. That's basically what's behind verse 19. And then take a look in verse 20 at who's rejoicing. See, it doesn't say all of the evil, all of those who were greedy are mourning her loss, not because they loved her, but because they don't get the cool stuff that she provided anymore. Their marketplace is gone, their customer base is gone. But who's rejoicing in her downfall? Those who rejoice in her downfall are those who saw beyond her money. Take a look at who it says in verse 12. It's the apostles and the prophets, those who saw through the eyes of God what was really going on here. Those who saw, basically according to what Jesus said in Matthew 6:20, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For those who are kingdom minded, those who are heavenly minded, those who see the true value will look around at the excess and go, this is not good. This is not a thing to build a strong economy on. This is not a thing to build strong families on or a strong society on. And when it's gone, there will be a certain amount of rejoicing where people are going to go, oh, good. Finally, our reliance on those false things are gone. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's hard. Yes, a lot of people are going to be hurt. But the bottom line is the false principles we were building a false society on are gone. And there's something to rejoice about in that. And then finally, we get to the point where we look at Babylon's judgment. Let's take a look at it in verses 21 through 23. Then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone and threw it into the sea and said, with such great violence, the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. The music of harpists and musicians, pipers and trumpeters will never be heard in you again. No worker of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a millstone will never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again. The voice of bridegroom and bride will never be heard in you again. Your merchants were the world's most important people. By your magic spell, all the nations were led astray. It shows a handful of metaphors for what happens to her. Let's take a look at them one at a time. First of all, the millstone that we read about in verses 21 and 22. What is a millstone? The millstone here is a symbol of our neglect of the basics of life. And what is it? We don't use millstones today commonly, so what is it? I want you to imagine a huge rock that is probably anywhere from 3 to 8 feet wide, and it's basically the shape of a donut. Imagine a huge donut, 3 feet wide to 8 feet wide, and anywhere from 1 foot to 3 feet thick. So a big donut. And there's a spike in the middle of it so that it spins, it turns around. And it's rough. It's a rough rock. Okay. So when it turns, and often powered by mules as they spin this rock, between the rock and the ground, or between that rock and another rock, is where they would put their grain, where they would put their wheat, or anything else that needed to be milled, that needed to have the good part separated from the useless part. So the millstone is a basic tool by which they prepared their food. The first place that wheat or barley would go from the field would be to the millstone, because you had to separate the chaff from the good part of the wheat or the good part of the barley. So the millstone was the first line of defense for eating. If the millstone was gone and you couldn't separate the chaff from the flour, then you couldn't eat. So and it's massive and it's heavy. So the idea of a millstone going into the water, you will never get that out again. So the millstone is cast in, and that's the permanence of it. But then it also says the sound of a millstone will never be heard in you again. The millstone was the sound of productivity. If you had a town where millstones were constantly running, that's because they were constantly producing food. So during harvest season, the sound of millstones through a town never stopped. And it was the sound of productivity. It was the sound of food being produced for the people. Not the sound of luxury, but the sound of productivity, the sound of people not going hungry. And what he's saying is, you're never going to produce the basics again. It's gone. Because you neglected the basics of life in favor of luxuries, you're never going to be a creative and productive place ever again. So that's, again, our society is heading towards that, right? We are so obsessed with our luxuries, and if we do face a real tragedy, the concern becomes how will we produce our food? I don't know how to grow food. I don't know how to slaughter a cow. I've never had to. I hope I never have to. But a culture that completely loses the ability to do that puts themselves in a place of risk, especially if they're trading it for luxuries. And by the time of the end times in Babylon, that is seriously what's going to happen. So that's what the millstone means. Secondly, it says that the light will go out. The light of the lamp will be gone. The light is always a symbol in Scripture of godliness and guidance. So you're not going to be able to see your way in the dark anymore. You're going to walk in darkness. You're not going to know. You're going to be lost in sin and darkness. And then it says the sound of the bride and bridegroom won't be heard in you anymore. And the bridegroom and bride are always symbols of purity, of celebration, of love, of family, of commitment, of community, of God. all of those wonderful things. Think about all the wonderful things at a wedding and a wedding reception. And basically, what he's saying is, since you played the harlot by bringing in all these other gods, and you convinced the rest of the world to play the harlot with you and neglect me as your groom, then you're going to lose all of the joys that come along with committing yourself to a spouse for the rest of your life. That's not going to happen for you anymore. And then verse 24, the chapter finishes out with this: in her was found the blood of the prophets and of God's holy people, of all who have been slaughtered in the earth. So the blood of the prophets and the saints are a symbol of the guilt of Babylon. It reminds me of Pilate trying to wash his hands to symbolically remove his guilt for offering Jesus in sacrifice. It never comes off. That blood is never removed. So this is a complete. This is a harbinger. Love using big words. Uh, this is an indicator of what's to come. That sin will eventually be completely removed from creation, completely removed from the earth. We will never have to see it again. It's not entirely gone yet, because we still have that interesting little blip at the end of the millennium that we'll get to in a couple sessions. But next time, chapter 19, if you're tempted to not continue, you're going to need to come back, because the next time in chapter 19, we finally get to the second coming of Jesus. We've seen the rapture already. We are now heading towards the second coming. So the tribulation ends, the battle of Armageddon, and Jesus' second coming. The greatest event in the history of the earth comes out in next chapter, chapter 19. So we'll see you then.